Well, as you can see, it's a bright and sunny day here. So if I can see my screen, I'll talk you through the the slides in this video. You see that the title of the video is called Neuropterida. And if that doesn't sound like the name of an insect order to you, that's because it's not an insect order. It's actually a group of 3 orders that we're going to cover today. So when I first took taxonomy, and for many years after, all of these orders were put together into the single order Neuroptera. It's now been recognized that even though Neuroptera in that sense, or Neuropterida as we're calling it, is a monophyletic group, people have generally recognized 3 different orders within it because there's quite a bit of differences in their biology, even though it's sometimes difficult to come up with diagnostic characters to actually distinguish them, particularly in things like the fossil record, where you probably have only wings to look at. These 3 orders are the Raphidioptera, or the snake flies, the Megaloptera, and the common names they go by are things like Dobson flies or Helgermites. I didn't put that down there, but that's what the larvae of Dobson flies are called. Fish flies, alder flies, and the like. Now, both of those orders are fairly small. We're talking at most a few hundred species. And then we have the Neuroptera, which is probably the most familiar to you, which includes quite a diverse range of organisms. Lacewings and antlions you're familiar with, and then there are several other families that go by their common names will be an adjective and then lacewing, like pleasing lacewings, beaded lacewings, silky lacewings, and things like that. But these are recognized as separate families. In terms of the interrelationships among those orders, that seems to be pretty straightforward. First of all, Neuropterida is a monophyletic group. Then, of the 3, the 2 that are most closely related are the Megaloptera and the Neuroptera, and the Raphidioptera being the 3rd group on the outside. Neuropterids are generally considered to be the sister group of Coleoptera plus the Strepsiptera. And so once we get done with this video, that's going to be the subject of the next one. I'll move on to them. This is a group of orders where there are abundant fossils for some groups and not too many for others, but it seems that they originated quite a while ago, at least in the Permian. So we're talking more than 250 million years ago. And so all of those fossils, of course, are going to be compression fossils, primarily of wings. And because these things are generally pretty soft-bodied, they don't preserve well as compression fossils in terms of being able to distinguish features of the morphology of the body. So let's begin with the Raphidioptera, or the snake flies. This is pretty much a relict group. There's only about 260 species in 2 families. It's the only order, I believe this is still true, the only order of holometabolous insects that has been completely characterized in terms of its species diversity. There might be a few that poke their heads up, a few new species that appear from time to time, but generally this is the most completely known of the holometabolous orders, in part because there's so few species. The 2 families are the Inoceliidae and the Raphidiidae, which I'll show you pictures of in just a second. If you look at the fossil record, though, whereas today these species have a relict distribution, they were formerly much more widespread in the fossil record, and that should say now absent from South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Australian regions. So we have fossils from those areas, but there's no longer any living species there. So here's the first family, the Raphidiidae. This is the larger of the 2 families, and in terms of its characteristics, these are characteristics of the Raphidioptera as a whole that I've got here. I mean, this is a good example in which to illustrate those. So these characters are true both for the Raphidiidae and the Inoceliidae. An elongate pronotum. Here you see this neck-like structure here. That's actually the first thoracic notum. Pronathous mouthparts. So the mouthparts are directed anteriorly, and this is something that's very characteristic of organisms that are predatory. And in fact, both the larval and the adult stages, the Raphidiidae and the Inoceliidae are predatory. The forewings with the subcosta ending in the costal margin. You can see that. I'm not sure if I can. I believe here's the subcostal vein that comes up and ends in the costal margin, the anterior margin of the wing. And then you see this elongate appendicular ovipositor, very reminiscent of what you see in things like Hymenoptera that also have an appendicular ovipositor. Once we move on from here, let me think a second. The ovipositor of the females is basically insofar as they have an ovipositor, it's not appendicular. It's formed from secondary structures. More typically, it's just the apical abdominal segments that they become extended and tubular-like and can be extended. But here we have not vestiges, but modified appendages here. That's what I mean when I say that this is an appendicular ovipositor. The Raphidiidae are characterized by the adults having ocelli, but that is not true in the Inoceliidae, as the name implies. They have no ocelli, so that's basically the way you separate Inoceliids here from Raphidiids. I'm not sure if you can see it here because it kind of blends into the background. It's the elongate ovipositor on this guy. So as I said, these are generalist predators. Many species, especially in the immature stages, develop under bark. And so they're feeding upon organisms that are living beneath the bark or in the fissures in the bark. One of the interesting things about this group is the fact that the pupal stage is active. They have exarate pupae. And so this is the pupa on the right here. This is a larva. How can you tell the difference? Notice in the larval stage, there are no wing buds. It's a endopterygote insect, a holometabolous insect, and so during the larval stage, if the wings are developing internally, and then they get everted at the pupal stage, you can see the wings that have been everted, and so you can, although they otherwise look very similar, you can distinguish the larval and the pupal stages. But the point here is that this exarate pupa, and by that I mean the legs are not pressed and glued to the body, as for example if you think of a pupa of a lepidopteran or a beetle. The legs are free, and these pupae can actually get up and walk around, and actually the mandibles are functional too in the pupal stage, so it's very, very unusual. And that's about all I have to say about the Raphidioptera. That they're very, very interesting and iconic group, very easily recognizable, but very poorly represented in terms of numbers of species. There are species of Raphidioptera that are native to the U.S., but they're more south and southwestern in distribution than around here. Now, that's not true of the second order that I want to bring up here, the Megaloptera. Like the Raphidioptera, there are only two families recognized in Megaloptera. These families are the Cyalidae and the Chorydalidae. The Cyalids, which go by the common name of fish flies or alder flies, is the less species rich of the two. There's about 70 species or so in there, but they can be very common. And common and very obvious. The Chorydalidae have a good number of more species, 200 species or so. Both of these are local taxa that you can find here quite easily, and they're worldwide in distribution. The larvae of the Megaloptera are all aquatic, and they have on their abdomen lateral gills that help them to breathe. These are not appendicular gills. That is, they are not things like you see in the gills of mayflies with the abdominal gills. These are just outgrowths, extensions of the abdominal wall. The larvae are predatory. The adults are rather short-lived, and so they might feed upon pollen or something like that, but they're generally not, even though they have the visage of being very dangerous predators. In fact, they're not dangerous at all. Let me show you what I mean. This is an alderfly, a cyalid. Generally, these things are about a centimeter, maybe a centimeter and a half long, so they're generally quite small. Dark colored is the kind that I'm familiar with, and very abundant in aquatic environments. Their larvae are predaceous and can often find the adults sitting on the vegetation alongside ponds, lakes. You go up to the reservoir there off of 315. I've forgotten the name of the city park there. You can find quite a number of alderflies in that area. So that's what the adult looks like. The wings held this roof-like pattern. The wings in a tent-like shape over the back of the body. Here's the larva. Pronathus mouthparts. It's a predator. Here's the abdominal gills, and if you look closely, you can see that silvery thread running up into them, which is the trachea. Even in these aquatic stages, the tracheae, they have a tracheal system that is air-filled to get oxygen to their tissues. One of the distinctive things, and this will show up more clearly in comparison with chorioidalids, is that the larval stages here have a terminal abdominal filament. That is, the last segment has a single filament that extends posteriorly, and there are no prolegs on that last segment. So that's the larva. You've seen the adult. Here are the eggs. The adults lay their eggs in these large masses on vegetation like cattails and things along the edges of the ponds, or the streams where the larvae live. Cyalids are characteristic both of running water and standing water, ponds and lakes and things like that. And they lay these large egg masses that are kind of gray in color. I've looked many times, but I've never found any egg parasitoids of these. It seems like they would be great candidates to have egg parasitoids, but they're not attacked by my wasps. Chorioidalids, in contrast to cyalids, are generally larger, sometimes much larger, and whereas adult cyalids are pretty muted in color, dark gray, black sort of things, we get some pretty spectacular color patterns, especially on the wings of some chorioidalids. So here we have a female with the spotted wings. Another one, even more elaborate, a tropical species. The most common ones that we have locally, we get some of these kinds of coleodes in the running waters, small streams down in the Hocking Hills. The ones that are more common and really attract people's attention are the large Dobson flies. This is a female Chorioidalis cornutus. Chorioidalidae is the family. This is the genus Chorioidalis. This is I can tell this is a female because she's got short mouth parts and these large grayish wings. Compare that to the male. The males have these spectacular, long, sickle-shaped mandibles that look like they would deliver quite a nasty bite. In fact, those mandibles are pretty soft and unsclerotized, and I don't know that anybody has ever ascribed a function to the males having the large mandibles because they're so soft. They're certainly not very adept in male combat to get access to females for mating. So what exactly that's all about, I don't know. Typically, I start getting emails, I think in May or something like that, when the adults of Corydalis start to emerge from their aquatic habitat, because these things are big and they're quite noticeable and they're attracted to light. So people that live um, next to water bodies, these Corydalis, the fish flies, the dobson flies, are particularly common in running waters. So if you live next to a a river or a stream that has these in them, these will be attracted to the lights of your house and land on the edge. And so about mid-May, start getting emails asking, what the heck is this thing? And is it dangerous? Will it hurt me? Obviously, they're totally harmless, and the adults are short-lived. They're basically just going to mate, oviposit, and die. This is the larva of a corydalid. The common name that you'll sometimes see is they're called hellgrammites. Some people use these very commonly as fish bait. Um, Remember that when I was describing cyalids, I said they had a terminal abdominal filament and no apical prolegs. The opposite is true here in the corydalids. We see the abdominal gills here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 abdominal gills for each of those segments. No median filament coming out here, and you see the two not tarsal, but the two claws at the apices of the abdominal prolegs in the back. So that's, aside from the large size, if you get a small corydalid larva, that's how you would distinguish it from a cyalid. And then let's move on to the most diverse, most heterogeneous, and most species-rich group of the Neuropterida, and that is the order Neuroptera. People have tried, the phylogeny of Neuroptera is not well understood, or not well elucidated, let's put it that way, at all. There's some of these are pretty rare, and they have some very extreme modifications, especially in the larval stages, that make them very specialized creatures. And well, we just haven't figured out how they're interrelated in any great detail. Neuroptera, in terms of characteristics that would that be true for everyone in the group, those characteristics are pretty few and far between. But one of them is the possession of modified mouth parts in the larvae that are mandibulate, in the sense that you can clearly recognize the typical clearly recognize mandibles, maxillae, labium, and such. So they don't have the modified proboscis of something like a lepidopteran or a housefly or something like that. But these mouth parts in the larvae are modified to take in fluids. Actually, the Neuroptera are characterized generally by extracellular digestion. That is, they emit digestive enzymes into whatever they're eating, because they're all predatory, and then they suck up the juices back through these modified mouth parts. Let me show you what I mean by this. So you probably don't read Italian, but you can, I think, probably figure out a lot of what's going on here. So this is the head of a Neuroptera larva. So we have the lateral compound eyes with a few facets, and these Ommatidia are separated on the side of the head. Elongate antennae, and these are the labial palpi coming out in front. But you see the mandibles and the maxillae here are elongate, and here we see in cross section through the combination of mandible on top and maxilla on the bottom, is that these two mouth parts are coordinated via a tongue and groove, what the Italians are here calling a coaptation, coaptazione. Sorry, my Italian's terrible. So that they are moving in a coordinated fashion, and between them there is a channel for the emission of digestive enzymes from the gut into whatever they're feeding on, and then the ingestion of the fluids from the body both the hemolymph and from the degradation, the enzymatic degradation of muscles and other tissues within the body of their prey. Let's see, up here, this is a cross section, a longitudinal section through the head of the larva with the combined mandibles and maxillae here. Those elongate labial palpi, antennae. And what it's showing here is the digestive tract, the anterior part. This means pharynx, and it's showing the muscles that are inserted on the frons or the clypeus, probably both, definitely both here, inserted there or originated there, and then inserting on the dorsal wall of the cibarium. So remember I talked about a cibarial pump in the Psocoptera and in the Hemiptera more generally. These muscles contract, increases the volume here, and that increased volume causes a suction, enabling them to suck fluids into their digestive tract. I stumbled a little bit there over whether the muscles are originating or inserting. Generally, a muscle has 2 points of attachment, right? And there are some general rules for saying that the muscle starts here, it originates here, and then inserts or ends there. And the more basal structure is usually considered the origin. It's like a muscle that's going from the thoracic wall into the leg. It will originate in the thorax and insert on the leg. But sometimes, as in the case here with these cibarial pump muscles, it's kind of ambivalent of which one is origin and which one is insertion. Basically, we have 2 points of attachment of the muscles is the critical point there. So, sucking mandibulate larval mouthparts, both larvae, and I should qualify the adults, whether they're predatory or not. Many adults are predatory, but they will also, some of them will feed on plant materials, feed on pollen, of course, feed on sugar sources as well. But there are some that are predatory as well. This first family that I'm mentioning here, the Neuropterida, I bring it up here not because it's a local species. In fact, there's just a few species of this group that are scattered throughout the Old World, in the Mediterranean region, all the way to Australia. But this is the basalmost group of the Neuroptera, and interestingly, the larval stages are aquatic. So we see aquatic larvae in the Megaloptera. We see the basalmost lineage of the Neuroptera are aquatic. You might hypothesize that the common ancestor of all three of these orders, or at least these two orders, were also aquatic. It's unclear whether this is true. Some people have even extended that argument that the ancestor of Holometabla had aquatic larvae. We see aquatic larvae in the Plecoptera, which is getting up close in some phylogenies to Holometabla. The Megaloptera have aquatic larvae. The Neuroptera looks like maybe aquatic larvae are ancestral for the group. We're eventually going to talk about the order Mecoptera, and the basalmost family of Mecoptera has aquatic larvae. It's unclear. I think probably the evidence is that the evidence in support of an aquatic larval stage for the ancestor of Holometabla is weak at best, but you will see that hypothesis proposed. Nevertheless, in the case of Neuroptera, the basalmost family does have aquatic larvae, typically found in fast-flowing streams. Let's take a look at this. Here we have, let's see, different adults. The adults are kind of generalized and not very, they're not very spectacular. We're going to see some spectacular adults and particularly larvae in the Neuroptera. But in the case of the Neuropteridae, the adults are generally kind of a mundane Neuropterans, lacewing type of appearance. Here's the larva, though. You see these beautiful mandibulate pronathous mouth parts here, and remember, it's aquatic, living in these fast-flowing streams. Not going to find this family here, but if you travel to Europe or Australia, perhaps you'll be able to find some larvae of these. All of the rest of the Neuroptera, and we're talking about I believe 16 more families, are basically divided into two groups. In two monophyletic groups. The first of these, I'm going to run through some examples of them, are put together in a group called the Mermeleontiformia. So you can probably recognize what this group is made up of. It's the ant lion forms, 5 families, and so it includes the ant lions. That should have an H there, Psychopsidae, the Neuropterids, Nymphids, and Ascalaphids. I'm just going to talk about a few of these and show you some of the peculiar modifications that are found in the group. The most common one, the one you're probably most familiar with, at least from seeing the evidence of them, are the antlions, the family Mermeleontidae. They're most famous for some of the larvae living in these sandy, friable soils where they construct traps, these cone-shaped pits. The larva of the antlion is lurking there within the substrate at the bottom of the pit, and the idea is that organisms, classically ants, walking along the surface, get on this loose sandy soil and tumble in, and once they're down there, the antlion larva captures it. Of course, if it were an insect that could fly, it could relatively easily escape. So adult ants can't fly away. So these pits are pretty easy to find and pretty common. If you're quick, you can dig down at the bottom of the pit and capture the larva. But if you're not quick enough, they're going to keep burrowing away. They might be difficult to find. This is what the larva would look like. Again, classic pronathous mouth parts. Somewhat elongate prothorax here, supporting the head. So this looks pretty much like that line drawing with the Italian captions on it that we saw before. This is what you would find at the bottom of one of those antlion pits. Many people are less familiar with the adult stages of the antlions, which can be fairly large. You talk a couple of centimeters in size. This is a species that's got a nice color pattern on the wings. They're pretty generalized. You see the filiform, that is the more or less thread-like antennae. That'll come up here in a second in the context of another family. Elongate body, fairly soft body. All Neuroptera are fairly soft-bodied in the adult stages. So if you're trying to build a collection of them, you're probably best off to keep adult specimens in vials of alcohol, because when they dry, the soft bodies will collapse, and they're generally not very attractive. Also, in many cases, you will lose color along the way. Not something like this, but some of the green lacewings and things lose their color along the way. I have seen some collections where people actually spread the wings, particularly in some of the more spectacular ones with the beautiful wing shapes and color patterns on them. But that's generally not the greatest way to preserve them. Now this is one with the spectacular wings. This is the family Neuropteridae. They are characterized by just having, well, there's quite a bit of variation in the hind wing shape, but it's in the hind wing shape that you use to recognize and distinguish species there. Some, like this one, have more or less, I don't know, what would you call that, lanceolate hind wings with a long, narrow base, and then flaring out at the tip here with nice color patterns on them. Some Neuropterids have huge spoon-shaped hind wings, spatulate hind wings, and so they can be very very diverse, and that's the taxonomic character that people rely on in order to distinguish species. I haven't seen too many of these in the adult stage personally. This is the larva of a Neuropterid, and this one of the unique, obviously the unique thing about this, or the striking thing, and I'm telling you that it's unique about them, is this very, very elongate neck that supports the head. So if you just look at the head here, it's the typical Neuropteran sort of head capsule, but this elongate neck is unique to the Neuropterids. That's how you can recognize the larvae of these things. The Ascalaphids, or owl flies, is quite a species-rich group. Not the most, but many more species than you might think. Kind of looks like an amalgamation, doesn't it, of different insect orders, almost like I put together wings and body and head from several different insect orders in order to try to fool you on an exam. So Ascalaphids, adults are recognized by having these knobbed antennae. Remember I was showing you the antlion adult had the filiform antennae. These guys are characterized by these knobbed antennae. The wings, I mean, all neuropterans, all neuropteridans have extensive wing venation, but these are kind of reminiscent, aren't they, of dragonfly wings here. It's in both the color patterns and in the extensive venation in there. These guys are fairly good flyers, rapid flyers. I remember running through the landscape in South Africa trying to catch one of these guys. Of course, I hadn't gone there to try to capture an owl fly, and so I didn't really have the right equipment. I utterly failed. It escaped from me along the way, but it can fly rapidly enough to avoid being caught. I thought I had a picture of an Ascalaphid larva here. Maybe it's out of order. We'll check in on it in a second here. So that's the first group of the Neuropterida. We remember Neuroptera. We started out with the Neuropteridae. Then we had two groups, the Myrmeleontiformia, so the antlions and their relatives, which we just talked about. And then the rest of them all belong to this group called the Hemerobiiformia, which in terms of being able to enunciate characters to recognize it, more they're I guess you would say they're more recognizable for not being the other groups than for what they actually are. There are several families here. I'm not going to cover all the families that you might run into here in North America, let alone worldwide, but I will cover a few of these that have some interesting tidbits about them. The green lacewings, or the chrysopids, with which you're probably, I'm sure you're familiar with those. The brown lacewings, or Hemerobiidae, which is probably the most common ones that you will come across. Giant lacewings, spongilliflies, the Cicerids, dusty wings, or the Coneopteriges, mantispids, and then we'll end up with the beaded lacewings, or the Barothidae. So, green lacewings are very iconic, aren't they? They are commonly found as predators and encouraged as predators of aphids, particularly in the immature in the larval stages. Although the adults will also feed upon aphids. The name actually, although they're called green lacewings, and some of them have distinctively green bodies, the name Chrysopidae actually means golden eyes, which I've always found to be one of the most striking characteristics of some species, is that the eyes are like these little golden jewels. Let's see here. A larva of a chrysopid. Again, typical, this is the mandibles plus the maxillae here. You can see the labial palps emerging from underneath. Pronathus in position. Again, that's something that's characteristic of predatory insects. They want to reach out, if you will, to attack something rather than bringing it close to the body. So the mandibles are projecting forward in order to grab their food. These are some classical chrysopid eggs. Many chrysopids, not absolutely all, but very commonly, they lay their eggs on stalks from the plants, and you can go and just search through the vegetation, and you can find these eggs, or at least what's left of the eggs, very commonly around here. So you have these elongate stalks. The egg is up here. The larva hatches and then crawls down. So one function that's been ascribed to this is that because these larvae are predatory, this kind of separates the larvae as they're initially hatching, and so they're not immediately eating one another as they emerge from an egg mass. That argument is a little bit undercut in that some of the chrysopids, well, I can show you on the next picture, will lay a set of eggs coming from a common, actually these are intertwined stalks that come up here for the eggs. Another suggestion is the function is to avoid what actually has not been avoided here. This is one of my little wasps that has found this cluster of chrysopid eggs. You can tell they've been parasitized. A couple of things. First of all, there's a wasp sitting on them, although that's a male, so he's waiting for the female wasp to emerge in order to mate. You can see then this one that the cap has been cut here. That's the doing of a wasp emerging. And also notice the color, that instead of being white or an unparasitized egg, you'll be able to start to see the larva developing within the egg. But if they've been parasitized, they turn this gray, dark gray color, sometimes even black, entirely black in color. So then you can tell that they've been parasitized. So one idea is that they put these things on the stalks in order to prevent egg parasitoids that are wandering around on the surface of the plant, which is a leaf probably up here and out of focus, so that they don't find the eggs. Obviously, this is not a 100% foolproof strategy, or maybe there's yet a different reason for having these stalked eggs. Who knows? Or a combination of things all going on at the same time. Then we come to the Hemerobiidae, which is a very species-rich group. They're not so, not at all as attractively colored as the green lacewings, the Chrysopidae. Common names for these things are brown lacewings, which is generally the kind of color they are, sort of a dull brownish, grayish in color. But this is probably, in terms of the number of species and individuals, the one that you're most likely to come across in places like central Ohio. The Polysticodidae are known as giant lacewings, and there's really only a very, very small handful of species of these giant lacewings. I mention this only because it was only in the past few, oh gosh, when was it? It was when the Entomological Society of America meeting was held in Dallas that Norm Penny, who was a specialist on both Mecoptera and Neuroptera, reported that through his databasing efforts, looking at specimens of Polysticodids around the country, discovered that no Polysticodids had actually been collected and placed in collections, or I should specify the eastern species of Polysticoda, for decades. Presumably this thing has gone extinct in the eastern United States. There's still species in the western US and a couple of more in other parts of the world, but our eastern species apparently has gone extinct. So if you find a Polysticodid in the east, that would be big and exciting news. Unfortunately, it appears that we've lost this thing. No one knows why, because no one knows practically anything about the biology, either in the adult stage or in the larval stages of these things. We would presume that the larvae were predatory, but where to look to find them, no one knows. The Caesarids are actually, so this looks like a big insect, right? That thing is probably about a centimeter long from the tip of the wing to the front of its head. So they're small, but they're not particularly uncommon. They are very interesting, though, in that they lay their eggs near waters, and then the larvae enter the water, where they live as obligate predators, get this, of freshwater sponges. So they will find sponges in fresh waters and feed upon the cells that make up the sponge. Once the larvae complete their development, they'll then crawl back out of the water, pupate, and emerge as adults. I don't know that I've ever found a freshwater sponge in looking for them, but I've caught plenty of Caesarids along the way. So apparently freshwater sponges are more common than one would think. And that's why they get the name spongilliflies, because they feed on the sponges. The Coleopterigids, or the dusty flies, are probably one of the, if not the smallest in terms of overall body size of all the Neuroptera. We're talking about an organism here. Well, you can see from the venation of that leaf that this thing is sitting on how big they are. We're talking something on the order of 3 or 4 millimeters long at the most. They're surprisingly common, but because of their small size, as is typical, people tend to overlook the smallest insects, especially when they seem to be as nondescript as this little guy. But they're very characteristic, in their wing venation. They have a relatively simple wing venation in comparison to all of the rest of the ones I've been talking here in the Hemorrhobiiformia. Very simplified wing venation, and they're characteristically covered by this sort of what looks like a waxy secretion, this white dusty secretion all over the wings, and that's why they get this common name of dusty wings. As I said, they're super common, and there's a good number of species out there. As in all Neuroptera, the larvae are predatory, and people have been very interested in them as predators of mites. The adults can be predatory, but they will also feed on plant material as well. The mantispids are, well, you can see why they get their name, right? I can't think of how many times I've been recording this video, and the word for those forelegs has always escaped me. I've always meant to say raptorial forelegs, these forelegs that are designed to reach out and grasp prey and pull it back to the animal. So we see these forelegs, these raptorial forelegs in the mantispid are similar in overall shape to what you saw in mantids and what you see in a wide variety of other predatory organisms. Things to notice here, like mantids, and they have an elongate prothorax, but notice you can distinguish them immediately from mantids, even at a distance, by the fact that the forelegs are attached to the front of the pronotum and not at the back where the forelegs of a mantid, where the forecoxae of the mantid would be. These distinctive little creatures are rather uncommon, but not so much as you might think. I'm not exactly sure why, but when we bring our plants in at the end of the summer to try to coax them to survive through the winter, there's been more than one occasion where we looked up at the window and found a mantispid sitting on the window, having emerged from the plants. Probably what's going on is related to the fact that mantispids, is related to the biology of the larval stages of mantispids. Here we see a mantispid on a leaf that has scattered I don't know, that's probably hundreds, if not thousands of eggs over the surface, these very, very minute eggs. Mantispids are, the immature stages are associated with spiders. The larvae, some of the larvae are actually parasites of spiders. That is, they will get on a spider and bore through a soft part of the body to consume some hemolymph. But basically the larvae are predators of the eggs of spiders. So if a spider lays a cluster of eggs and covers it with silk, the mantispid larva will get inside there and feed upon those eggs. And so they're associated with spiders. I guess this speaks to the number of spiders that my outdoor plants pick up back here when we bring them back inside, because we've got mantispid larvae in there as well. And then finally, we have the family Barothidae, or the beaded lacewings. The adults are, I don't know what you think about that, but that's a pretty nondescript sort of adult for me. But there's a couple of interesting things about the larval stages of barothids. One is that they, I don't want to overgeneralize. There are some species, particularly in the genus Lomamia, in which the larval stages are specialized as termite predators. So that what the larvae do is they feed upon termites. It's been suggested that they may actually also emit chemical cues to attract termite workers to them, where they can then attack them. But the most bizarre story, and I'm not sure that I actually believe this story, but there is a published report that the larvae of barothids are able to incapacitate a termite worker by, let me choose my words carefully, by the emission of a gaseous cloud from the anus that somehow causes the termite to become totally incapacitated, at which point the barothid larva can start feeding on it. This has appeared in the peer-reviewed literature. As far as I know, this report of toxic farts has not been corroborated by any independent studies, but it's certainly something that makes for a good story, I think. I should also give credit here. His name is blocked out. This is Matt Bertone. He's from North Carolina State University, who is an absolutely fantastic photographer of insects, and some of his work was in this PowerPoint today. So I didn't want to get into all of the fine details of the families of Hemorrhobiiformia that you might run across, or some of the more exotic families in the Myrmeleontiformia, because frankly you're just not going to see them very often. And if you do, you're going to have to rely upon, in the adult stage, you're going to have to rely upon wing venation in order to distinguish them. I see for some reason the picture, excuse me, that I had of the larva of Ascalaphidae never did pop up. And so what I'll do is I'll post that in an announcement on Carmen, so you can check out one of those fantastic larvae, because they're absolutely, I mean, if the thing were 6 feet long, it would be as frightening as a great white shark, I think. Anyway, to summarize what I've covered here in terms of the Neuropterida, again, generally 3 orders are recognized these days: the Rhaphidioptera, Megaloptera, and Neuroptera, in the strict sense, Neuroptera. I say in the strict sense because you don't have to go very far back in time to find all of these things collectively referred to as Neuroptera in the literature. The larvae are generally predatory, and this is also commonly true for adults. And while the adults may have the typical mandibulate mouth parts, many of the larvae in the Neuroptera sensu stricto, that is, have those modified mouth parts for ingesting fluids. Rhaphidioptera are recognized by their elongate pronotum and appendicular ovipositor. And it's not unique, but the unusual fact that they have these active pupae, in which they can walk around and avoid disturbances, and they can even bite you. They wouldn't hurt you. They're not that large, but the pupae are active. There are two families: the Rhaphidiidae, which is the most common one, and the Inosceliidae, both families of which are found in North America. In the Megaloptera, these guys are characterized by having aquatic larvae. So some of them quite large in the case of Hellgrammites. Again, two families: the Cyalidae, the alder flies, and the Corydalidae, the Dobson flies is the most common name I've seen them called. And then finally, most of the species diversity and diversity in terms of number of families is found in the order Neuroptera. These have those modified larval mouth parts where the mandibles and the maxillae have that channel in between them by which they secrete or release, let's use that word, enzymes into their prey, and then they can suck up and feed on fluids. So while they have mandibulate mouth parts, they're actually not chewing per se on their food. They're fluid feeders. Quite a diversity of families, 17 families found worldwide, not all of them in the US, and some of them are pretty rare. And in the case of Polysticodens, they seem to be declining quite rapidly, or maybe they've already reached the end point in some of those individuals. But others are very common, particularly the chrysopods and the hemorrhobiids, and well known for a couple of things that as predators of things like aphids on plants. And I didn't mention this, but also chrysopods also use acoustic communication between the sexes in order to find mates. And so they vibrate their abdomen and send sound to the substrate for them to find one another. So that kind of summarizes everything about that I wanted to cover here today in terms of the Neuropterids. And next time, I'm not going to be able to give them complete justice because we're going to talk about the beetles and the Coleoptera, and it's such a huge group, and we just don't have enough time to go into all the gory and fascinating details about beetles. But that's where we're headed next: the combination of Coleoptera and the Strepsiptera. So until then, have a great weekend if you're viewing this before the weekend, or I hope you had a great weekend if after. We'll talk to you again soon.